This week, an interview with Michael Cohen, creator of comics including Strange Attractors and Tangled River, which we'll discuss. As a teenager, Michael was involved in creating the first known comic book price guide. He's also co-host of the Unpacking Peanuts podcast, and we'll talk about Charles Schultz's strip, including about the reason why Michael has no interest in Peanuts animation. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for helping to keep the show going. You can pitch in by pledging at least $2 a month at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. And now my interview with Michael Cohen. All right, I'm talking with Michael Cohen, who is in Italy. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Well, now, I shouldn't ask this because I've been living in Tokyo for 36 years, but why do you live in Italy?
Oh, it was always a fantasy. It seems like an unreachable fantasy, but I fortunately had kept my entire comic collection from the 60s. And also I kept them in really good shape. So when the time came, it was my 60th birthday, I went, well, I gotta have to sell these at some point. What's something I actually want. And turned out to be an apartment in Italy. So
I see.
And quite happy here.
Okay, cool. Now, you're originally from Los Angeles?
Yeah, born in New York, grew up in L.A.
Okay. Well, I have a completely non-comics related question for you. I have noticed that your last name, people who grew up in New York pronounce it cone, like ice cream cone, and everybody else says Cohen. Has that been your experience?
I know my dad's experience was a lot of his New York friends would say Cohen. I was always Cohen when I grew up, but...
Do you have any idea why that is, that New Yorkers say cone?
I don't know. I mean, the name had so many spellings. A lot of which...
sometimes there's no E.
Yeah. Basically, at Ellis Island, when the immigrants came over, the people just wrote down whatever they felt like. And so, my grandfather was actually Cogen. He was from Ukraine, but the G is silent, so he said Cohen.
Okay.
So I guess you don't argue when you don't have any leverage over these things.
No, it's true. So for listeners, I know of Michael mainly because he's part of the Unpacking Peanuts podcast, where they're going through all 50 years of Charles Schultz's strip. But he has a lot of other comics-related stuff on his resume. We'll talk about Peanuts a little bit later. Sure. So first, I always like to ask, what comics did you read growing up?
Okay, well, this would be pre-collecting. And since, I didn't have any money, it was sort of up to my mom what she felt like getting when I was sick. And, she didn't know anything about comics, but I think she made some good choices. She really liked getting me the DC science fiction strips, like Mystery in Space and Strange Adventures. So I grew up with a fondness for that kind of goofy 1950s science fiction. And when I started collecting, it was, I guess my first real passion was Green Lantern, who was kind of from that tradition of science fiction-y style DC heroes. And it was, and also the Adam Strange stories, Mystery in Space. So I wasn't really seriously collecting for a few more years, but I read them, and I sort of loved that stuff.
Okay. So what most influenced the comics that you're making?
Well, I was, I guess, unfortunately, really attracted to the really great artists. So I had a tough row to hoe of trying to learn that stuff because I just wasn't good enough. but an early, outside of Jack Kirby, who I just loved, but I know I could never draw like that. Yeah, I really like the EC guys, Al Williamson, Wally Wood, then, the Alex Raymond. So that was sort of my fantasy of, boy, I'm going to learn to draw like that. Of course, I couldn't. Then when, I guess around 1970, when Barry Windsor Smith started doing this Conan stuff for Marvel, which was not a genre I was particularly interested in, but the art was so gorgeous, kind of this pre-Raphaelite influence, that he became my hero for years. I tried to draw like that and failed. And then the last big influence on me, because I never was actually finishing anything, I was just doing a couple of pages here and there, was Jaime Hernandez, the early 11 Rockets. And to me, that was like, whoa, it's simpler, but still it's like unbelievably great. So when I finally decided I was going to, A, finish some stories, and B, later actually publish them, what I did with Strange Attractors, which was kind of my meshing of the early Hernandez Brothers science fiction stuff and the Adam Strange goofy DC stuff. So that was, I was collaborating with my friend Mark Sherman, and he was a big science fiction fan. And so we came up with this weird amalgam and ended up publishing 17 issues of Strange Attractors.
And that was self-published?
Yeah, early 90s. So, influenced by Dave Sim and kind of the self-publishing movement. We learned that, yeah, it's actually possible to break even and maybe make a few bucks self-publishing. And so that was a big chunk of my life back then, was working on these comics and learning to draw.
Okay. And then speaking of finishing something from a long time ago, you're now working on that again, right?
Yeah. I mean, the really devastating blow is Mark died a couple weeks ago.
Oh, no.
Yeah. He'd been sick for a while. And yeah, I mean, we hadn't worked on it since I think our last issue was like 1996. And then I sort of have this passion for going back and finishing things that I'd started. And I approached Mark. He was sick at the time, and I thought also that it'd give him something to concentrate on. And so yeah, we did a few pages together, and then he passed. And one of the last things he wrote me was, he says, I can't do it, but you have to finish it. Ooh. So I'm gonna try.
Okay.
Got a long ways to go, but it's strange working alone on this.
So what was the division of labor on that when you and Mark were doing it?
Well, to prove that I could actually finish something, I created it, wrote and drew it, and there's like 50 pages of early Strange Attractors, which wasn't publishable. And I think it was probably 91 or 92. I took a long trip to kind of decide what I wanted to do with my life. And when I came back, I said, okay, I want to actually do a comic that people might want to read, that looks okay and is interesting. So yeah, so I called Mark, and we had a lot of big planning sessions trying to update Strange Attractors, make it more, a real story rather than just goofy adventures. And so, we're working with characters I created, and then Mark came in with his point of view on things, which is a lot more daring than what I was doing. He was really interested in postmodernism and experimental, a lot of interesting science topics and things. And so for most of the time, he would send me a script. He would give me the script, 1 page a week. That's what we did. And I would break it down, draw it, and occasionally, change a few things that I thought were confusing. And that was our working process. At some point in between, I moved to the other side of the country, and we were able to continue, over the phone, basically.
Okay. So I happened to stumble this evening across the title, Strange Attractors, has something to do with dynamic mathematics.
Yes, it does. And
I'm not even sure what dynamic mathematics is.
Yeah, I mean, I got a D in geometry in school, so, but I was very interested, and Mark also, in reading books on physics and interesting modern concepts. And Strange Attractors, when I saw that, I went, what a great name for a comic. And it turns out someone else used it later on.
Yeah, I found there were a few other comics using that title.
And that's a million books. Yeah, I mean, it's a theme of the book, but it's a little hard to explain to people what it is.
Yeah, so you've got a bunch of it on Substack now, and I read through that. So I don't know if I could attempt to explain it. It's science fiction, kind of a soap opera, I felt like. Yeah.
Well, one of the influence, I mean, me and Mark were interested in a lot of things, and we wanted to put in kind of a romance element. Mm-hmm. So it was science fiction, romance, comedy, adventure, everything we liked. It was just a big mishmash. And yeah, I mean, so we published, 15 issues of Strange Attractors. We went to Caliber, published 2 issues as Moon Fever. And at that point, the sales, it was pretty clear the sales were not going up because it was hard times in the mid-'90s with Image coming along. And so when we quit it, and I eventually compiled them in a big omnibus, which is available, on various websites and Kindle, which collected everything. But when I started trying to finish it and realized, well, I had to do a few revisions to make this all work, I decided, well, let me try to start posting them like daily to see if we can get people to, I mean, it's a load to ask people to go read a 400-page book that's not finished. So if you go, all right, I see if we can get anybody. I was always embarrassed by the early issues, but I thought, okay, I'll put up one a day on Substack and also on Facebook. And so I've been continuing that, and I have like the first 2 issues up now.
Okay.
And I think I'll just continue this because people are not gonna. I don't know. I mean, it was always an odd book, and at least it has some historical significance now.
Is there some do you know how it ends? Is there a whole plot written down somewhere?
We didn't. I mean, we knew vaguely, very vaguely, how it had to tie up. But when we stopped publishing, we had no idea how it was going to get there. Because if it would have been a little more successful and we were able to make some money on it, we would have continued. And, the thought of, well, maybe someday, we can make a living, which is, a total fantasy. Make a living. I mean, few people were able to, but it wasn't likely. So, in the last couple of months, Mark and I would get together, or on Skype, and brainstorm on, okay, if we're going to end this, we've really got to just focus and stop adding new material and new characters. And
yeah, that was a disease that my comic had, but
unfortunately the ending is still, I mean, I know really where everyone has to end up and what they have to do, but I have no idea how to make that work. And that's going to take me a while, but I think it'll have a satisfactory ending.
Now, at the same time, you're working on Tangled River, right? And that's also on Substack.
Yeah, well, I'm not working on it because I finished it a couple of years ago.
Okay.
But I am posting daily, and that was so after Strange Attractors, I did very little work for the next 20 years, some short stories. which I published in various anthologies I was editing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like I was already here living in Italy, and I thought, okay, the two main stories I did were never finished. The other one was in an anthology called Mythography. It was like stories about fantasy stories. I published in an anthology. That was never finished. So I thought, okay, I've got to finish something. And I was absolutely determined to do a big graphic novel in color, because now I was working digitally, so color was not as and not as. So to make sure I finished it, I actually scripted this 300-page graphic novel. So I knew exactly where I was going, and I knew roughly how long it would take. And it took 6 years. And I finished it. And I don't think I'm going to ever try to top that. I think that's, if something's going to survive of my work, it would be that. So I'm also putting that up on Facebook and Substack daily.
So how would you describe Tangled River to the listeners?
It's very different than Strange Attractors, which, I mean, the comedy element in Strange Attractors, things were not believable. But I actually wanted to do, my ambition was to do a young adult novel. And put it in a setting, in a science fiction setting, but keep it very much down to earth. So it ended up, the narrative structure is there's this 14-year-old girl growing up on it's really the first interstellar space colony sometime. And, it's not really distant future, but maybe 30, 40 years in the future. And the colony, at some point in its growth, all the technology mysteriously stopped working. So when she's growing up, there's all these remnants of, the advanced colony, but nothing works. And so here's this kid growing up, she's never seen a book because everything was computerized. There's no computers. They're basically living a medieval, hunter-gatherer life in this colony. And the book is essentially it's her journal. She's narrating it. And she's not someone who would ever go off and have adventures. I mean, her best friend is someone like that, but she takes care of her mom. She does her schoolwork. But something happens and she gets sucked into this adventure, which her mom gets involved with, and she feels she has to go along. And so it's every scene and every panel in this, except for a few flashbacks, is from her point of view. So it never cuts to anybody else. So I tried to do, okay, it's going to be a one-person point of view. You're in her head because she's writing her journal. And there's this big mystery hanging over, what happened? What made this happen? So the story eventually evolves into her discovering what happened. And her relation with her mother, her relationship with her best friend. So it turns out, I had it up on Comic Fury. I don't know if you know that.
Not really.
It's a website. It's the best webcomic site for me. I've tried them all. And even though Comic Fury is not that well known, I still got like 2.5 million views over the years.
Wow.
And it still gives me the most views for my stuff. So I highly recommend Comic Fury. But I noticed that when I was publishing it, as I'd finished each page, I'd put it up. It was like one a page a week. So I'd get a lot of comments, and they clearly weren't from kids. So even though I was aiming for a young adult novel, I finally realized I'd love that to be the audience, but it doesn't seem to be. So
interesting.
Yeah.
I noticed reading Strange Attractors and Tangled River, a couple of things that they have in common. One is that both have, I want to say, mostly female characters.
Yeah.
Which I was a little surprised. You don't often see a comic by a man that's so dominated by women. How was that a conscious choice, or just kind of happened that way?
It was a conscious choice, but it was also some of my favorite comics at that time. And my best friend during that self-publishing period was Jimmy Gownley, who did Amelia Rules, which had a really strong female lead, female character. Also, Strangers in Paradise, and certainly the Love and Rockets books all had female characters.
Sure.
And I thought, I hope I could capture that point of view, and I certainly tried. And everything I did, and I realized years later, like, oh, I'm always writing the same story over and over again, which I think is true of a lot of artists. It's because really the Strange Attractors, it's the relationship. A big part of it's the relationship between Sophie, who is, she's like a museum curator who just wants to be left alone, and her crazy friend Widow, who, is off with ray guns and spaceships. They're still best friends. And I realized in Tangled River, subconsciously, it's, Tanya is kind of the introvert, and her friend Licorice is the wild adventurer. And in a way that reflects the Maggie and Hopi relationship. So yeah, I mean, nothing's original, but you get your own style from what you try to copy.
Sure. The other similarity I noticed was that in both cases, comics are part of the story. Because in Strange Attractors, Sophie is always looking at that Spicy Space Stories comic series.
Right.
And Tanya is drawing a comic, isn't she?
Yeah, subtly that's sort of in the background, but I mean, if you read the whole thing, you'd realize that she, growing up in a culture that didn't have books, was essentially didn't know anything about comics, but she liked drawing and she liked telling her story. And eventually it comes together. And certainly comics and collecting was part of it.
Right. And that's been part of your life for a long time. So
yeah, it was a huge part of my life.
Kind of makes sense. It seeped into the comics.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always envied the autobiographical guys. I mean, some of my favorite comics, that I was reading in the 90s were all the Canadian guys who were writing, they were basically the main character of the comic. I never wanted to do that, but I think that it gets in there somehow.
Now, is your drawing process at all different from what it was 30 years ago? Is there anything computerized about it now other than putting it on Substack?
Yeah, it's totally different. I mean, that's been the challenge going back to Strange Attractors, which, was drawn on paper with pen and ink and brush. And when I'm going back and trying to continue it, but I'm working digitally, with a pen and a tablet and, trying my best to imitate it. But no, my style, it's 30 years later or more. And I don't draw the same way. So it's a little frustrating that, this looks different, but in some ways I have way more control. Okay. And I actually can do things I couldn't do back then, which was basically change stuff, fix things.
Right. Yeah. It's easier to fix that. I don't know, like when I was working on my comic, I was telling you about my comic before we started recording, but I don't know, I mean, obviously the technology is advanced in 20 years. I had a old style Wacom tablet with no screen on it, right? And I tried it and I didn't like it, and I never drew any of my comic with it. But maybe it'd be easier now with the tools that we've got now.
I mean, it's essentially. I mean, Wake. I was using that too with Photoshop when I started. And I no longer use that. But it's got huge advantages. As things you could do, still with pen and ink, but it'd be a lot more work. I mean, for me, the biggest advantage is layouts, because that was always I'd look at the Hernandez art and I go, this looks so simple, but for some reason, it's perfect. Everything is in exactly the right place. And so what I can do now is draw each figure in a different layer and then move them around to construct the panel layouts, which I couldn't do before. Before I went, I'd do rough pencils and start inking over that. So I was kind of like stuck with whatever I did.
Coming up, Michael's involvement with the Argosy Comics Price Guide and his lack of interest in Peanuts animation, and more. By the way, don't forget we have a voicemail. To leave us a message, click the Leave a Voicemail link on the sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Tell us what you think of my talk with Michael, our look back at FF films, our discussion of Jack Kirby's 1970s work, or anything else we've covered on the show. This podcast is part of the Deconstructing Comics Network, where we're grateful to our supporters on Patreon. Patrons get exclusive extra content. At $2 a month and up, hear Bat Bits, a Batman 66 exploration with my brother Paul. At $4 a month, you also get our new monthly show Silver Age Batman, where I discuss Batman comics from the 50s and 60s with either Paul, Patrick, Emmett, or Kumar, as well as our previous series on Jim Starlin's run on Captain Marvel and the first 50 issues of Amazing Spider-Man by Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Romita. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics. And thanks for your support.
Who's Who, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe.
Spanning from the first issue of Who's Who in 1985 all the way through the loose leaf edition.
Including all the updates, the spin-offs, custom Who's Who pages for forgotten characters, and tons of in-depth character spotlights.
Entries span from the golden age of DC
and into the extreme 1990s.
Covering characters such as Superman by Kurt Swan and John Byrne.
The Justice League by Kevin Maguire.
Batman by Dick Giordano.
The New Titans by Tom Grummett.
Wonder Woman by George Perez.
The Legion of Superheroes by Keith Giffen.
The Flash by Carmine Infantino.
Lobo by Simon Bisley.
The All-Star Squadron by Jerry Ordway.
Firestorm by Al Milgrom.
Aquaman by Chuck Patton.
So many entries talking about Ian Karkull.
The Forever People again, and again, and again.
And hundreds of other characters found in Who's Who, the definitive podcast of the DC Universe.
Available wherever you find podcasts and at fireandwaterpodcast.com.
Nuclear Man, Batman, Hawkman, 2D Man, and Hour Man.
Who are all these people, man?
They're all part of the DC Who's Who.
Now, I've been listening to your podcast, and I've pretty much memorized Jimmy's introductions of,
Yes.
of you guys. So he always mentions Strange Attractors and A Gathering of Spells, which I have not read. Now, is that also finished?
Yes, it is. That after I finished Tangled River, I knew I didn't have the energy to do anything new. But the second strip I did, and I mentioned this anthology mythography. I was running a serialized fantasy story that, for 8 issues. So I had 100 pages in black and white finished. And after finishing Tangled River, I went, okay, let's finish everything. So it was a big project. I went back, had to re-letter everything because my lettering was terrible. And I colored everything because I could do that easily on the computer. And then I went, okay, now I've got to finish it. So I added another 30 pages. So it was originally called Empyrean Tales. and that became A Gathering of Spells, which when I finished it, again, it's up on the websites, and it's also, on Indie Planet and Kindle. And there's a new company called NE1, which basically is doing digital comics at a good price, and they wanted to publish everything I had, so all that stuff's on NE1 now, in digital versions.
I see. So, but NE1 can publish on the site.
NE1 can publish. Yeah, it took me a while to figure that. That's what the name was.
Well, speaking of good names for things, I like the kind of pun of the Unpacking Peanuts podcast. Packing Peanuts. Okay, I get it.
We can't claim credit for that. There's 3 hosts, me and Jimmy Ganley and Harold Buchholz, and Liz is our producer. But it was Harold's wife who came up with that.
Okay.
When we were first thinking about it. And it's like, whoa, that's like perfect.
Yeah. Okay. I was wondering about that. So, and in Jimmy's intro of you, he also mentions your band, Complicated People.
That's the latest edition of my bands.
Okay, so you I assume you had bands in the States before you moved to Italy.
We had bands in the States, and one of them, going back to the late 80s. So I've been writing songs, so it's mostly doing my material.
Okay, well, what kind of music is it?
It's everything. That's another reason why I have trouble marketing my work, because you really can't categorize this stuff. I mean, if I hear something I like, I'll go, I'll try to write a show tune or a cowboy tune or something.
I see.
So we're continuing that. Liz is the lead singer, my wife. So we like to keep things hopping.
Yeah. And then the thing that really surprised me when I first started listening to your podcast was that the intro also mentioned that you were involved in making the first comic book price guide before Overstreet. I was like, before Overstreet? There's such a thing as before Overstreet?
Yeah, again, this is just like a tiny bit of trivia. And at the time, it didn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. But it turns out like that's probably going to be on my tombstone.
So explain about how that came about.
Okay, well, all right, I'll try to keep it short. So Tom Horsky and I were best friends, and he and I collected comics starting in I think 1963, sort of when his big brother had a couple of issues of Fantastic Four, which I read, and that turned me into a Marvel zombie. Same with Tom. We'd never seen anything like this. So we started just fanatically collecting, but there was, in those days, it was all newsstand, so you can get the new issues. But there was no way to ever find any back issues.
Right.
So even stuff from the 50s was impossible to find. So we started, I guess, every Saturday getting on our bikes in LA and riding all over LA looking for used bookstores. Mm-hmm. And LA was a real mecca for used bookstores. And, so we'd find a bookstore, we'd go in and we'd say, hey, you got any comics? And often they'd come out with, a little stack and, for a dime or a nickel or whatever. Mm-hmm. And we were able to accumulate, these were only a couple years old, but it was like, oh my God, this is from 1959. We accumulate lots of copies of, Detective and Batman and Green Lantern and Flash and stuff. And I wasn't aware of fandom at the time. I wish I was, because I certainly would have contributed. Maybe an original strip or something. Mm-hmm. Didn't know anything about it. And then after, so we'd go really far, ridiculous distances to check out some old bookstore. And eventually, it was around probably 64, we hit Hollywood Boulevard, which is a real mecca for used bookstores. A lot of them sold old movie books, books about film, cinema, theater, and you can also get, old photo stills from movies and things. And there was one called Cherokee Books. And this is like one of the highlights of my life was that day. We were familiar with comics in the late 50s. The DC revival of superheroes occasionally would publish a little feature on these 1940s comics. So they'd have, they brought back, the original Flash. And so we were aware that there were comics in the 40s, but again, there was no way to ever see these or know anything about them. Right. So anyway, we go into Cherokee Books, and the ground floor is like movie books, millions of them. And so we do our usual, hey, you got any comics? He said, yeah, go see Bert upstairs. So we climbed this rickety staircase to this little room, a glassed-in room upstairs, and we walk in, and there's Bert, who we thought, was like the coolest person in the world. He was probably like 18, but he was kind of like a beatnik type. And he's sitting behind this massive desk, and the desk is covered with Golden Age comics.
Wow.
Thousands of them. And there's boxes on every wall, and they're all labeled, All-Star, Captain America, Select Comics. And it was just like we fell in a rabbit hole, and this was like... So we basically, started hanging out, and for some reason Bert liked us, even though we were like 12-year-olds. But we had to bow down and call him like the king. He called himself the king of comics. We had to worship him. And he eventually allowed us to... So there's this inner room, the inner sanctum, which had all the Golden Age stuff. There was the cabinet where he kept the incredible books like Superman #1, Action 1, Batman 1, and he let us look in there. But these were locked because some of these were worth like $100. Most of the books in the inner sanctum were $5 and up, so they were out of our reach. We can never ever get these. Yeah. But there was an outer room which was loaded with boxes, and this was everything else, all the 50s and 60s books up to that time. And he thought, these kids worship me. Maybe I can get them to sort through these boxes and put them in some kind of order. So he'd pay us $1 in credit. These were quarter books to work. And so we worked for Bert for a couple of years going in there. And that's how I got, a lot of my books. Me and Tom's has acquired a pretty good collection. But there was two other bookstores that had comics. Well, one was Collector's Books, which was a few blocks away, and they also had Golden Age books. We ended up working for them, doing the same kind of stuff. And then we hit all the other bookstores, and there was one called Argosy Books. And we'd go in. He had a few. He didn't have much. But, we'd go in regularly just to check. And he's the one who, he'd chat with us, and he realized we worked for Bert and Leonard and Mal at Collectors. And he went like, so you guys probably know what these things are worth. And we went like, oh, yeah. I mean, we've gone through them a million times. So he said, how about this? I'll give you each like $25 if you will write me a price guide. Because he had this crazy notion that he could publish this and sell it in the fanzines. So it was the Argosy comic book price guide. And we thought, wow, $25. Yeah. Comics. So sure, we did it. And Tom has a better memory of this than I did, but we were lazy. We were like 15 at this time. This was 1965. And so we knocked it out as fast as we could with no research. Like, okay, let's see, action number 1. Okay, $100. Number 2, I don't know what, 20? Sure, 20. It's really the worst you can imagine. And he did kind of a shoddy printing job, but he printed 100 of them.
100, okay.
And we didn't really see him after that. I mean, we each got a copy. I thought, wow, something's printed that we did. We went on with our lives, working at collectors and stuff. But it was years later that, after Strange Attractors, I started going to San Diego Con every year. Mm-hmm. And, just chatting people up. And, I met a lot of friends in the comic community. And I met Bill Shelley, who was publishing books about the early days of comics. Mm-hmm. Really nice guy. And he said, hey, are you the Michael Cohen who wrote the Argosy Price Guide? And I was like stunned that anyone knew of it. I said, yeah. And he says, I'd like to do a limited facsimile edition and sell it. Mm. I went, oh, sure. Go ahead. So he printed it up, and I guess, had a lot of connection. Now, he'd written a book, a book called The Golden Age of Comic Fandom, which really good book, the early history of fandom from, the science fiction fandom of the 40s to the people who were publishing, the 60s fanzines, which is Alter Ego and lots of others, hundreds of them, which I didn't know about. And so I guess it was the next year when I went back to San Diego, he had a copy of this book. Oh, there was no video here.
Well, I can see it anyway.
The Golden Age of Comic Fandom by Bill Shelley, a book-length history of comic fandom's early years. And he showed me there was a page on our price guide. And it's sort of, that gave it some cred. And then it started popping up in various, websites, this is the first comic book price guide, and it started becoming quite collectible.
Okay.
So anyway, that's my story. It's a little embarrassing to look at, and the prices are ridiculous.
Okay, I was going to ask you what you based them on, but it was kind of based on whatever you came up with.
Well, we could have gone to Burt's. I mean, who knew? There were a lot of people selling old comics in the fanzines, but we didn't know about that. So, there was the Buyer's Guide and Rocket's Blast, which had ads for comics. So basically, our prices were based on our memory of what Burt would be selling them for.
Okay. Yeah, I know there was a Batmania publication at the time, too, fanzine.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of different titles.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Tons of them. And I've collected some of those too. And yeah, I went, boy, I sure wish I knew about this when I was a teenager. So anyway, that's the story of the first comic book price guide, which
I see. Okay.
A little embarrassed about.
Yeah. And then Overstreet came out in 1970, I found. And I don't know what they based theirs on either, but maybe they looked at
probably on the fanzine, people who are selling stuff through the fanzines. Because the web, the web did not start having any listings. Yeah, I was stunned when I decided to sell my collection through an auction house. Mm-hmm. And I got a lot more than I thought I was going to get.
I should figure out what to do with my closet full of long boxes.
Well, depends how old they are and what condition they're in.
Well, yeah, they're mostly like mid-90s to about 2014, I think.
Yeah. I mean, certain issues certainly have value.
Yeah.
You'd have to really know.
So let's talk about Peanuts. I'm sorry.
Okay, let's talk about Peanuts.
I interrupted you. Sorry. All right. So I've been interested in how you and I guess maybe Harold also were not very familiar with the later Peanut strips. And I'm kind of in the same boat because as a kid, I had read the late 50s stuff and the 60s and 70s. I read those over and over. The 80s strips, maybe I read them once in the paper. And then I came to Japan and I didn't really have a way to read Peanuts in the 90s. And so as I'm reading along, as you guys are doing the podcast, I'm reading these for the first time. But, what little I saw in the 90s, I had the impression that the strip wasn't as good then, but there are some good 90s strips. But I'm wondering how you would compare the 80s and 90s stuff with the earlier stuff. Do you still think of the 60s as the heyday?
Yeah, even the late 50s, because I started reading as a kid. Probably I was getting the yearly collections starting around 1954, 55. And every year the new Peanuts book would come out, and I'd buy that. So for me, it was, I had the books, I read them a million times, but also we had the paper subscription to the Los Angeles Times, which of course, ran Peanuts daily on page 4. So it wasn't buried, and the Sunday colors were on the front. When you'd see them in the news on the newspaper. What do you call those things?
Those glass boxes
you on every street corner. You can see Peanuts. So I absolutely loved that. It was like a huge influence on my outlook of the world. I felt there was I had a friend in Charles Schultz. But I went off to school in 1970. Didn't get newspapers and lost interest. So when Jimmy, we started talking about this project, I said, well, I can do it through the 60s. I have no idea what comes after. And he says, well, we're going to do them all. So you'll like them. So I kind of signed on to the Great Peanuts reread. And we've read every strip up through 1994 so far.
Yeah.
And still, doing it weekly. So there's one tonight, as a matter of fact. No, but I totally agree with you. I occasionally would run across the 70s strip, and I'd go, yeah, it's not brilliant, but it still looks the same. It's still good. And occasionally I would, just horrified if I ran into a 90s strip, and I'd say, what is this? There's like one panel, and there's Zipatone, and there's characters that I have no idea who they are. I totally dismissed it, but Jimmy's kind of got me, signed on. Let's stick it out, and I'm sticking it out. But 70s was okay. The 80s was, I think it still looks good, but it's kind of lost the charm for me. And we're in the 90s, and I'm going, no, I wouldn't be reading this strip, even if I got the newspaper. I like Bloom County and Doonesbury, and yeah, I'm with you, but it's my job to be the co-host, so I have to be sort of it's not required, but I sort of have to sugarcoat my opinion, because people who love the later Peanuts are listening to this podcast. But also it's skewed in a way. We're reading every strip, but we can't talk about every strip because we spend a lot of time.
The podcast would never.
So we each pick the strips we think are worth talking about. So we might talk about for an entire year. It might be 40 strips. And those are, often the best. And so, we're still hitting strips in the 90s that are really good, but they're really kind of outliers now.
Yeah, some of the Sally stuff, or Linus and who's that girl that likes him? Lydia.
Yeah, Lydia and Sally are the two characters who are always funny for me. But The other guys, certainly Jimmy really loved 90s Peanuts. He's much younger than I. Harold's kind of in between. And this is his first take. The podcast is a lot about Charles Schultz and the amazing fact that he did this daily for 50 years.
Yeah.
Through hardships and, physical problems. He had horrible shakes in his hand. So they really admire and appreciate the fact that, considering all these factors, this is still pretty good. I'm not as forgiving, but I keep that to myself.
I see. Yeah, I was surprised by how much Zipatone there is in these later strips. That was kind of unexpected, and it definitely looks different with the
it looks
Zipatone.
totally different. Yeah, I was in shock when the Zipatone came in, and then when for the first time it wasn't 4 square panels. It's just like, what is going on here? And now, according to Jimmy, that rerun is going to become a major character. And we're doing 1994 tonight, part 3. And yeah, it's in the last third of 1994 that rerun strips start becoming common.
Okay.
And up till now, it's like, is that Linus or is that rerun? They look exactly alike.
Yeah, I remember. So I think rerun was introduced in like the late 70s, I think.
Yeah, I know. He's been around for 20 years.
And then for like years, you never saw him. Yeah. I remember noticing that at the time as a kid, and like, I wonder what happened to rerun.
Yeah, the Schultz didn't know what to do with them, apparently.
Yeah, I wonder why he introduced them to begin with.
The strips are he was on the back of his mom's bike, and that was it. But now he becomes a major character. I'm curious, but also I don't expect I'm going to really be liking this last 5 years.
Yeah, it's not the Ducky and the Horsey era.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's one of our 3 all-time favorite strips.
Right.
Yeah, so the podcast, we're, getting followers, we're getting attention. It's a hell of a lot of work, especially for Liz, who is editing these things.
Right.
And,
well, I edit my own shows. I know what that's like. Yeah,
well, she makes us sound like we're smart, which is not easy. So... we'll finish it, and then we'll continue doing Peanuts. But I would like to go back. We're still discussing what we're going to do when we finish the strip, which will be this summer sometime. There's lots to do, but I think when we started the podcast, we were doing a year in one sitting, which meant we were doing 3-4-hour podcasts. And so I had to read an entire year of Peanuts in like 2 days. And so I don't think we paid enough attention to the best years of the strip. And so now we're doing 3 episodes per year.
Right. In 1994, you got 4 episodes, I think.
Well, I'm hoping we can finish 94 tonight in 3. I don't think we've done 4 yet. But I'd like to go back and look at those earlier ones with a different focus. Like, okay, maybe do Linus and Lucy strips, the best of the year, or music-oriented strips, or, various other ways of looking at it, and spend more time talking about, because to me, it was like 55 to 70 is like one of the great achievements of the human race. And afterwards, it's an okay comic strip.
Those early years are so interesting to look at because it's so different. It barely feels like Peanuts at all in like 1950, 51.
Oh, yeah, the early stuff is weird, and I always kind of dismissed that when I was younger. Like, yeah, it took them a while to get it. What fascinates me is the evolution of Snoopy graphically. Yeah, you go back and look at those late 50s ones. It's not the same character at all as later Snoopy. I mean, he had this real long, curvy snout. He was really long and skinny, And now he's kind of middle aged, kind of a little pot belly.
Of course, he's a puppy in 1950.
Yeah, and then he started out as a puppy. So I wish someone would do some kind of animated morphing of Snoopy over the years. I think it'd be really interesting to see.
Speaking of animation, it's come up a number of times on the show that they don't have any interest in watching the Peanuts animation. Why is that?
Why is that? They've had me explain it several times on the podcast. I was a comic strip fan, and to me, anything else, there was commercials on TV, advertising stuff.
MetLife.
I had no interest in that, and I think when I got the first glimpse of what the animation looked like, it really bothered me that there was kids' voices, because that's not what I heard in my head. I don't know what I heard, but it wasn't a little kid reading lines. And so I never saw the first one, and I never saw any of them. And, Jimmy and Harold are huge fans of the specials. And I just told them, no, I'm not going to. I am interested in Charles Schultz. I'm interested in the Peanuts comics, and that's it. Don't care about the animation. I'll never watch them. So they've come to grips, and, I just don't say much on those episodes.
Yeah, I mean, you even had an episode where a couple of the former voice actors came on. And you were kind of there, but you didn't have any questions.
We've done some really good interviews, but also to have 3 interviewers seems excessive. We had Jeannie Schultz on, his wife. Mm-hmm. We've had Gary Groth, the publisher of Fantagraphics. A lot of cartoonists. And to me, it's like they don't need 3 people throwing questions at them. So I tend not to say anything then, because Harold and Jimmy are better interviewers.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other guests lined up for the future here?
We have ideas, and we have invitations sent out. Some of them are impossible, but Bill Watterson would be a dream.
Oh, yeah.
Any cartoonist who was influenced by Peanuts, we'd love to have on. So yeah, I mean, they're out there, and we have them roughed in our schedule for 2 or 3 more interviews. Mm-hmm. But I can't say. I don't know who it's going to be.
Yeah, Gary Trudeau.
Gary Trudeau?
Yeah, I mean, and he copied Marcy into his strip.
Well, you mean the Vietnamese?
Right. Yeah. Honey.
Yeah, I don't know if, I mean, it actually never occurred to me that might be a copy. I mean, with the thick glasses and the hair, but.
Yeah, I think it was intentional, but not completely sure. I wouldn't swear to it, but.
Well, I mean, every one of these guys was a huge Peanuts fan.
Sure.
You can't be a cartoonist and not be.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say is the most inspiring thing to you about Schultz's work?
For me...
For you as a comics creator.
As opposed to Jimmy and Harold, I was not influenced at all by Charles Schultz. So I never wanted to do cartoony comics. I never wanted to do funny strips. So I can't say he was an influence. It was an influence in my life because of his attitude when I was, a big fan of the 50s and 60s. Of his worldview was very dark. Shockingly so. And it wasn't a kid strip at all. Mm-hmm. I think it is more in the later strips. Kids would not understand this, but I was growing up trying to understand the world, and I learned a lot of vocabulary and, just things about the world from Peanuts. I was kind of a sort of a negative worldview, and it was just like, wow, there's another person out there who feels the same way.
Well, so we'll be continuing to listen to the podcast then, and you're going to be working on Strange Attractors. from this
Yeah, it
point?
might be a little while since I'm reprinting them. And I really need to think about how I'm going to do this. So I'll get back to putting up the new ones on the website. And eventually when I finish, who knows, a couple of years, I'll reissue the Strange Attractors Omnibus as a complete story.
Check the show notes for links to Michael's site, more background on the Argosy price guide, and more. Thanks to our patrons for supporting Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and our other podcasts. To join them, go to patreon.com/deconcomics. At deconstructingcomics.com, you can connect to us on X, Facebook, YouTube, and Blue Sky, and find links to subscribe to the podcast. You can comment on any episode on our site, drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, or talk to us. Click the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. The music backing the promotion of our Patreon is Change by Jazar. Next week, Emmett and I return to Jack Kirby's Captain America work with Captain America and the Falcon issues 201 to 203, in which our heroes face the Night People, an assortment of mental patients whose asylum has ended up in a very unusual place. We'll talk about all that next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.